This event was hosted by Gladiators New York City. Gladiators New York City is wholly owned and operated by Santa's Knights Incorporated, a nonprofit 501c3. Gladiators NYC is the flagship free martial arts and fitness program for Santa's Knights, providing free martial arts, fitness, activities, and events for children and adults all year long across the United States of America. To learn more about the Gladiators NYC, please visit their website at www.gladiators.nyc. Historical medieval battles, HMB, or bouhert, from Old French word for wallop, or armored combat, is a modern full-contact fighting sport with steel blunt weapons characteristic for the Middle Ages. Armor and weapons have to follow regulations on historical authenticity and safety published on official Battle of the Nations website. Fighters are covered in full modern produced protective armor, made from steel or other metal alloy if permitted, made to aesthetically be as close to their historical counterparts as possible. This in contrast to historical European martial arts, or HEMA, that uses modern protective equipment such as a modern fencing helmet, padded fencing jacket, modern padded heavy-duty fencing gloves, forearm and leg protection. Hits and blows may be aimed at any parts of the body, with the limitations set in the regulations. Both wrestling and percussive techniques are permitted. Unlike staged battles that can be seen at festivals of historic reenactment of the Middle Ages, the competitions in bouhert are the full-contact sporting events that are refereed by referees referred to as knight marshals, who have special training and combat experience. Points or hits are counted in tournaments known as duels. A fighter must deliver a certain number of blows, commonly 10, to their opponent, or gain the maximum number of points within a certain period of time. The tournaments are divided into shield sword, where fighters compete with each other using a shield and sword. Sword, where each fighter has a one-handed sword and no shield. Sword buckler, fighters use swords and buckler. The first fighter to hit 5 hits wins. Long sword fighters use, you guessed it, long swords. Non-standard weapons that do not fit in the first two categories, halberd, two-handed axe, two-handed swords, etc., are used for fighting. There's also a category called triathlon, with 3 rounds using different weapons, the first one being the long sword, the second one being sword buckler, and the third being the shield sword. There are unified international rules for the battles. They prohibit a number of very traumatic techniques, as well as regulate the admission of fighters and their weapons in order to observe the historical reliability of equipment, and also to eliminate serious injuries. Due to the fact that different countries used to have different fighting rules, the first unified rules were developed specifically for the World Championship on Historical Medieval Battle of the Nations. However, the rules used at a local tournament may still differ. For example, it may be prohibited to deliver blows to certain areas, such as below the knee or elbow. But the international rating events are conducted in accordance with the accepted international rules for historical medieval battles. Weapons are checked for correct measurements and safety before fighters enter the list. The first record of body armor in history was found on the Stele of Vultures in ancient Sumer, in today's south of Iraq. The oldest known Western armor is the Dendra panoply, dating from the Mycenaean era around 1400 BC. Mail, also referred to as chainmail, is made of interlocking iron rings, which may be riveted or welded shut. It is believed to have been invented by Celtic people in Europe about 500 BC. Most cultures that used mail used the Celtic word vern, or a variant, suggesting the Celts as the originators. The Romans widely adopted mail as the lorica hamata, although they made use of lorica segmentata and lorica squamata. While no non-metallic armor is known to have survived, it was likely to have been commonplace due to its lower cost. Eastern armor has a long history, beginning in ancient China. In East Asian history, laminated armor such as lamellar and styles similar to the coat of plates and brigandine were commonly used. Later, cuirasses and plates were also used. In pre-Qin dynasty times, leather armor was made out of rhinoceros. The use of the iron plate armor on the Korean peninsula was developed during the Gaya Confederacy of 42 CE to 562 CE. The iron was mined and refined in the area surrounding Gimhae. Using both vertical and triangular plate design, the plate armor sets consisted of 27 or more individual 1 to 2 millimeter thick curved plates, which were secured together by nail or hinge. The recovered sets include accessories such as iron arm guards, neck guards, leg guards, and horse armor bits. The use of these armor types disappeared from use on the Korean peninsula after the fall of the Gaya Confederacy to the Silla dynasty during the Three Kingdoms era, Three Kingdoms of Korea, in 562 CE. In European history, well-known armor types include the mail hauberk of the early medieval age and the full steel plate harness worn by later medieval and Renaissance knights, and a few key components, breast and back plates, by heavy cavalry in several European countries until the first year of World War I, 1914. The Japanese armor known today as samurai armor appeared in the Heian period. These early samurai armors are called the Oyoryo and Domaru. Gradually, small additional plates or discs of iron were added to the mail to protect vulnerable areas. By the late 13th century, the knees were capped and two circular discs called besagues were fitted to protect the underarms. A variety of methods for improving the protection provided by mail were used as armorers seemingly experimented. Hardened leather and splinted construction were used for arm and leg pieces. The coat of plates was developed, an armor made of large plates sewn inside a textile or leather coat. Early plate in Italy and elsewhere in the 13th to 15th centuries were made of iron. Iron armor could be carburized or case hardened to give a surface of harder steel. Plate armor became cheaper than mail by the 15th century as it required much less labor, and labor had become much more expensive after the Black Death, though it did require larger furnaces to produce larger blooms. Mail continued to be used to protect those joints which could not be adequately protected by plate, such as the armpit, crook of the elbow, and groin. Another advantage of plate was the lance rest could be fitted to the breastplate. A small skull cap evolved into a bigger, true helmet, the bassinet, as it was lengthened downward to protect the back of the neck and sides of the head. Additionally, several new forms of fully enclosed helmets were introduced in the late 14th century to replace the great helm, such as the sallet and barbute, and later the armet and close helm. Probably the most recognized style of armor in the world became the plate armor associated with the knights of the European late Middle Ages, but continuing to the early 17th century Age of Enlightenment in all European countries. By about 1400, the full harness of plate armor had been developed in armories of Lombardy. Heavy cavalry dominated the battlefield for centuries, in part because of their armor. In the 15th century, small hand cannon first began to be used in the Hussite Wars in combination with the wagon board tactics, allowing infantry to defeat armored knights on the battlefield. At the same time, crossbows were made more powerful to pierce armor, and the development of the Swiss pike square formation also created substantial problems for the heavy cavalry. Rather than dooming the use of body armor, the threat of small firearms intensified the use and further refinement of plate armor. There was a 150-year period in which better and more metallurgically advanced steel was being used, precisely because of the danger posed by the gun. Hence, guns and cavalry in plate armor were threat and remedy together on the battlefield for almost 400 years. By the 15th century, Italian armor plates were almost always made of steel. In southern Germany, armorers began to harden their steel armor only in the late 15th century. They would continue to harden their steel for the next century because they quenched and tempered their product, which allowed for the fire gilding to be combined with tempering. The quality of the metal used in armor deteriorated as armies became bigger and the armor was made thicker, necessitating breeding of larger cavalry horses. If during the 14th and 15th centuries armor seldom weighed more than 15 kilograms, then by the late 16th century it weighed 25 kilograms. The increasing weight and thickness of late 16th century armor therefore gave substantial resistance. In the early years of pistol and arquebuses, firearms were relatively low in velocity. The full-sight suits of armor, or breastplates, actually stopped bullets fired from a modest distance. The front breastplates were, in fact, commonly shot as a test. The impact point would often be encircled with engraving to point it out. This was called the proof. Armor often also bore an insignia of the maker, especially if it was of good quality. Crossbow bolts, if still used, would seldom penetrate good plate, nor would any bullet unless fired from a close range. In effect, rather than making plate armor obsolete, the use of firearms stimulated the development of plate armor into its later stages. Without being easily killed, full suits of armor were actually worn by generals and princely commanders right up into the 1710s. A sword is an edged, bladed weapon intended for manual cutting or thrusting. Its blade, longer than a knife or dagger, is attached to a hilt and can be straight or curved. A thrusting sword tends to have a straighter blade with a pointed tip. A slashing sword is more likely to be curved and to have a sharpened cutting edge on one or both sides of the blade. Many swords are designed for both thrusting and slashing. The precise definition of a sword varies by historical epoch and geographic region. Historically, the sword developed in the Bronze Age evolved from the dagger. The earliest specimens date to about 1600 BC. The later Iron Age sword remained fairly short and without a cross guard. The spada, as it developed in the late Roman army, became the predecessor of the European sword of the Middle Ages. At first adopted as the migration period sword, in the High Middle Ages developed into the classical arming sword with crossguard. The word sword continues the Old English swiord. The use of a sword is known as swordsmanship, or, in a modern context, fencing. In the early modern period, Western sword design diverged into two forms, the thrusting and the sabers. Thrusting swords, such as the rapier, and eventually the small sword, were designed to impale their targets quickly and inflict deep stab wounds. Their long and straight yet light and well-balanced design made them highly maneuverable and deadly in a duel, but fairly ineffective when used in a slashing or chopping motion. A well-aimed lunge and thrust could end a fight in seconds with just the sword's point, leading to the development of a fighting style which closely resembles modern fencing. The saber and similar blades, such as the cutlass, were built more heavily and were more typically used in warfare. Built for slashing and chopping at multiple enemies, often from horseback, the saber's long curved blade and slightly forward weight balance gave it to a deadly character all its own on the battlefield. Most sabers also had sharp points and double-edged blades, making them capable of piercing soldier after soldier in a cavalry charge. Sabers continued to see battlefield use until the early 20th century. The U.S. Navy kept tens of thousands of sturdy cutlasses in their armory well into World War II, and many were issued to Marines in the Pacific as jungle machetes. Non-European weapons classified as swords include single-edged weapons, such as the Middle Eastern scimitar, the Chinese dao, and the related Japanese katana. The Chinese jian is an example of a non-European double-edged sword, like the European models derived from the double-edged Iron Age sword. The first weapons that can be described as swords date to around 3300 BC. They have been found in Arslantepe, Turkey, and are made from arsenical bronze and are about 60 centimeters or 24 inches long. Some of them are inlaid with silver. The sword developed from the knife or dagger. The sword became differentiated from the dagger during the Bronze Age, when copper and bronze weapons were produced with long leaf-shaped blades and with hilts consisting of an extension of the blade in handle form. A knife is unlike a dagger in that a knife has only one cutting surface, while a dagger has two. Construction of longer blades became possible during the 3rd millennium BC in the Middle East, first in arsenic copper, then in tin bronze. Blades longer than 60 centimeters were rare and not practical until the late Bronze Age because the Young's modulus of bronze is relatively low, and consequently, longer blades would bend easily. The development of the sword out of the dagger was gradual. The first weapons that can be classified as swords without any ambiguity are those found in the Minoan Crete, dated to about 1700 BC, reaching a total length of more than 100 centimeters or almost 40 inches. These are the Type A swords of the Aegean Bronze Age. One of the most important and longest-lasting types of swords, as the European Bronze Age, was the Nau II type, named for Julius Nau, who first described them, also known as Griffzungerschwert, or, loosely translated, grip-tongue sword. This type first appears in the century 1300 BC in northern Italy, or a general Urnfield background, and survives well into the Iron Age with a lifespan of about 7 centuries. During its lifetime, metallurgy changed from bronze to iron, but not its basic design. Now, two swords were exported from Europe to the Aegean as far as airfield Ugarit, beginning around 1200 BC, just a few decades before the final collapse of the palace cultures into the Bronze Age. Now, two swords could be as long as 85 centimeters, but most specimens fall into the 60 to 70 centimeter range. Robert Drews linked the Nau Type II swords, which spread from southern Europe into the Mediterranean with the Bronze Age collapse. Nau II swords, along with the Nordic full-hilted swords, were made with functionality and aesthetics in mind. The hilts of these swords were beautifully crafted and often contained false rivets in order to make the sword more visually appealing. Swords coming from northern Denmark and northern Germany usually contained 3 or more fake rivets in the hilt. In the Indian subcontinent, earliest available Bronze Age swords of copper were discovered in the Indus Valley Civilization, sites in the northwestern regions of South Asia. Swords have been recovered in archaeological findings throughout the Ganges-Jamuna-Doab region of the Indian subcontinent, consisting of bronze but more commonly copper. Diverse specimens have been discovered in Fatehgarh, where are several varieties of hilt. These swords have been variously dated to times between 700 and 1400 BC. Other swords from this period in India have been discovered from Kalur, Raipur. Iron became increasingly common from the 13th century BC. Before that, the use of swords was less frequent. The iron was not quench-hardened, although often containing sufficient carbon, but work-hardened like bronze by hammering. This made them comparable or only slightly better in terms of strength and hardness to bronze swords. They could still bend during use rather than spring back into shape, but the easier production and better availability of the raw material for the first time permitted the equipment of entire armies with metal weapons. Through Bronze Age Egyptian armies were sometimes fully equipped with bronze weapons. Ancient swords are often found at burial sites. The sword was often placed on the right side of the corpse. In many late Iron Age graves, the sword and the scabbard were bent at 180 degrees. It was known as killing the sword. Thus, they might have considered swords as the most potent and powerful object. A longsword is a type of European sword characterized as having a cruciform hilt with a grip for primarily two-handed use. The longsword type exists in a morphological continuum with the medieval knight sword and the Renaissance era Zweihander. It was prevalent during the late medieval and Renaissance periods, approximately 1350 to 1550 AD, with early and late use reaching into the 12th and 17th centuries. The longsword has many names in the English language, which, aside from variant spellings, include terms such as bastard sword and hand-and-a-half sword. Of these, bastard sword is the oldest, its use being contemporaneous with the weapon's heyday. The French épée bâtarde and the English bastard sword originate in the 15th or 16th century, originally in the general sense of irregular sword or sword of uncertain origin, but by the mid-16th century could refer to exceptionally large swords. In the Masters of Defense competition organized by Henry VIII in July of 1540, listed two-handed sword and bastard sword as two separate items. It is uncertain whether the same term could still be used to other types of smaller swords, but antiquarian usage of the 19th century established the use of bastard sword as referring unambiguously to these large swords. The term hand-and-a-half sword is relatively modern, from the late 19th century. This name was given because the bounce of the sword made it usable in one hand as well as two. During the first half of the 20th century, the term bastard sword was regularly used to refer to this type of sword, while longsword referred to the rapier in the context of Renaissance or early modern fencing. Contemporary use of longsword only resurfaced in the 2000s in the context of reconstruction of the German school of fencing, translating the German langes Schwert prior to the term long sword merely referred to any sword with a long blade, long being simply an adjective rather than a classification. Historical terms for this type of sword include Spanish espadon, montante or mandoble, Italian spadalonga or sparadumane, Bolognese, Portuguese montante, and Middle French passot. Scottish Gaelic Clydheim Moor means great sword. Angelicized as claymore, it became to refer to a large Scottish type of longsword with a V-shaped crossguard. Historical terminology overlaps with that applied to the Zweihander sword in the 16th century. French espadon, Spanish espadon, or Portuguese montante may also be used more narrowly to refer to these large swords. The French épée de passot may also refer to a medieval single-handed sword optimized for thrusting. An axe, sometimes axe in American English, is implement that could be used for millennia to shape, split, and cut wood, to harvest timber, as a weapon, and as a ceremonial or heraldic symbol. The axe has many forms and specialized uses, but generally consists of an axe with a handle or helve. Before the modern axe, the Stone Age hand axe without a handle was used from 1.5 million years BP. Hafted axes, those without a handle, date only from 6000 BC. The earliest examples of handled axes have heads of stone with some form of wooden handle attached, called hafted, in a manner to suit the available materials in use. The axe is an example of a simple machine, as it is a type of wedge or dual-inclined plane. This reduces the effort needed by the wood chopper. It splits the wood into two parts by the pressure concentration at the blade. The handle of the axe also acts as a lever, allowing the user to increase the force at the cutting edge. Not using the full length of the handle is known as choking the axe. For fine chopping using a side axe, this sometimes is a positive effect, but for felling with a double-bitted axe, it reduces efficiency. Most modern axes have steel heads and wooden handles, typically hickory in the US and ash in Europe and Asia, although plastic or fiberglass handles are also common. Modern axes are specialized by use, size, and form. Hafted axes with short handles designed for use with one hand are often called hand axes, but the term hand axe refers to axes without handles as well. Hatchets tend to be small hafted axes, often with a hammer on the back side. An easy-to-make weapon, axes have frequently been used in combat.